You're listening to Inside Commerce, a weekly e-commerce strategy, technology and CX-focused podcast hosted by experienced digital consultants and re-platform specialists James Gedd and Paul Rogers. Get insights into e-commerce strategy and leading brands, hear from industry thought leaders and leading tech vendors with practical advice to help you improve your online CX. This episode is sponsored by WorldPay, and our topic today is about measuring redesigns and understanding how do you measure, when measurement should be focused on tangible versus intangible, and can you ever justify not having tangible commercial metrics as your success criteria? This is a conversation that Paul and I will come at from different angles because we work with different types of businesses. A lot of the projects Paul's works on are more premium fashion lifestyle brands. I work with a really broad mix, and there are different drivers in each of those projects. And we're bound to disagree on some of this as well, which is good. Healthy conflict on a morning podcast recording. And Paul flagged this to me yesterday. I thought it was a really good idea that we do this, is because there are lots of conversations in business about we want to redesign, but what does redesign mean? And when people are talking about we want to elevate the brand, common terminology I've heard in many projects, I want to elevate the brand, we want a more premium aesthetic. What does that mean? How can you define that objectively? Because how can you design and know something successful if you don't even know what it is you're delivering? So that's a setup. That was my ramble, Paul. What was the reason why you think this is an interesting one for everyone to listen to?
So originally we were talking about, or I suggested maybe we look at what is more in the context of replatforming project and how you get the most value out of replatforming project, and whether nowadays it's easier to migrate, so therefore it's easier to manage potential change with a redesign. And then that kind of led to, actually with a redesign, it's quite a dangerous position for a brand to measure and understand what's changing, and doing that at the same time replatforming is a risk. But I think your framing is right. So I think that, I have a lot of conversations around this. I feel like often the way the people that are signing off budget think about things is, I invest 200K, therefore I should see X immediately. And I think it's just trying to manage that. And I think for me, making an experience really usable and thinking about different kind of journeys and types of users and sources of traffic and everything else is really important. But I do think it's very important that you kind of, you're looking at the brand side of things as well, and thinking about users that have never come across a brand, don't understand the brand and the content that you're putting in front of them, etc. So I feel like for me, if you're doing a redesign, I do think, because I think we've probably both had very challenging creative and brand stakeholders in projects in the past. And I think, a lot of the time you're right. There's a lot of rubbish that is factored into these projects, or, there's a lot of, to use your word, like vanity in these projects. But equally, I do think if you're in the right vertical, and you've got buckets of people that, are coming to the site and don't know the brand, and I think you should be thinking about how do you best position your brand, best position your product. And a lot of that is going to be photography and lifestyle content. And I think that should all be part of a redesign. And I think the big discussion point here will be how and can you measure that? And I think we've had some challenging projects over the last couple of years where, it is really difficult to measure a redesign, especially if you're making bigger changes. And the other variable as well is when you start to think about lead times, and you start to think about, multiple sessions to purchase and multiple channels and everything else. So I think I'd imagine we'll come on to talk about when the right metrics are the right metrics, and softer conversion, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I come at this from an almost puritanical point of view, which is, it's not that I dismiss design, because I think design is hugely important. Design execution is fundamental to online success. But I come at it from the point of view that the projects are fundamentally e-com projects. And e-com is about selling. And yes, you have complicated user journeys, and you have new customers discovering, you have more considered purchase paths versus people who are there to buy directly and just want to get to a checkout. But fundamentally, you cannot lose sight of the fact that you're there to sell, because unless you are a content website, you're a transactional website. And if you're a transactional website, you've got to maintain a focus on the conversion path as well. And I guess the thing that I get frustrated by is when e-com projects get hijacked into brand projects and the decision making compromises e-com decisions that are in the best interest of the e-com team. But I'm also open to the fact that I'm not a design expert at all. And therefore, I'm always open to listening and understanding where the more design and creative led people want to take a project.
Yeah, I think without trying to conclude this episode right at the start, I do feel like kind of what you said, I think you should never deviate away from like core best practice usability and UX in most areas of the site. And then it's about layering your content on top of it. And I actually think, nowadays content is going to be like, everyone talks about CRO and whatever else. Like realistically, content is the thing that's going to, have the biggest impact in my opinion. And yeah, it's brand content and things like that. The one thing I would say is I think that nowadays, I think you can build for both types of user. So bottom funnel, someone that knows what they want, always repeat purchasing, go through, buy as quickly as possible. And then someone that has probably not been to the site before, is unlikely to have, high intent, is unlikely to know the brand. And I think that's where you start to build out more purpose-built landing pages that make it easier to navigate the catalog, and also start to introduce the brand as, more lifestyle content. Because I think the other thing is, if you were to look at conversion for that subset of traffic, it's going to be super, super, super low. So optimizing towards conversion is probably not the right way of necessarily measuring. And again, this is based on, I think, high AOV and kind of premium brand. But I think for me, if you're selling a considered item, I think you should have a purpose-built landing experience that then gradually takes you through to those more optimized like PDPs and potentially PLPs. But I think, if I'm completely new to a catalog, just being forced to go, into a PLP and using kind of core navigation, I think that's probably not as good a journey as you could build if you were building specifically for that, that type of user.
Ready to grow your business online? With WorldPay e-commerce, you can deliver fast, secure payments your customers love, backed by global reach and real people-powered support. Scale with confidence and enhance your customers' experience with WorldPay e-commerce.
Yeah, and this is what I want. The first question I've got, I want us to rip into after. Let's just preface it with the reasons that we normally see people driving into redesign outside of replatforming.
Yep.
But then I want to get into this brand elevation, what it means, because my concern is that I've seen projects where a focus on brand elevation and creating a premium feel then stops people thinking about the core. What you just talked through makes perfect sense, right? You've got a core set of users who are in purchase journeys, and those purchase journeys need to be really efficient, really fast, as frictionless as you can get. That's all the e-com stuff, right? I've got PID nav, I've got simple add to car. I can add from the PLP, I can quick add upsells on the PDP. I've got fast checkout methods, all of that stuff, right? And brand content shouldn't disturb that. It should layer around it and on top of it. So let's get to the areas where I see a lot of times people investing money is on brand refreshes. And that's when the overall business is rebranding. One of my clients, Heels at the moment, is going through that. They're repositioning the brand. Part of that's brand evolution. Part of it is about redefining the message and the story and so that it can talk to the younger audiences better. And part of that is visual changes, and that's it could be color palette refreshes, logo tweaks. That's simple execution. That doesn't fundamentally change the site. That is just updating brand delivery. The big one for me is when people say, we want to elevate the brand. We want to create a more premium experience. So first of all, I'm devil's advocate on this, because I think a lot of times people don't really know what they mean by that. They have a concept in their head of what it might be, but they sometimes they struggle to articulate it clearly in terms of what it should look like. Whereas the projects I've worked with on Hills, real clarity, great brand guidelines, really good visual clarity about what this means, how it plays out. So what to you is a premium experience? How do you objectively define a premium online experience?
Well, I think, to be honest, I think the two things you just described, in my opinion, are the same. So I think for me, elevating the brand or elevating how you're presenting a product is really considered consistent brand guidelines all the way through. I think it's the front end being built in a very kind of, again, considered and performant way. So like, really polished theme, kind of really kind of clean rendering, etc. And then I think it's purpose-built templates to house your best content. And for me, that is what like a premium brand should be doing. It's like you as a brand, hopefully, will know what content your customer resonates with the most, what best sells your product, everything else. So it's really like thinking about how you use that content alongside, other content but like put it in a really purpose-built performant template. And then I think in terms of premium experience, for me, it's entirely about the kind of stylistic side of things and the theme being built in a very premium, consistent, tidy way. And I think, I can in my head like imagine two examples like straight away, and I feel like you see these like premium brands that will have really good photography, but like, and their themes are built really poorly, like their content is just shoehorned into standard kind of PDP templates, and they're kind of hiding a lot of their best content, like everything's just very standard. And then also you can kind of feel that their kind of brand guidelines are like lost in the way that the kind of themes built. And I think for me, a premium experience is just end-to-end considered styling and the theme being built with an objective of getting the most out of the content, and also being consistent with kind of other channels as well. Because I think that's another thing, like, there's so many examples of brands, and I'll use Strathbury as an example, actually. So someone we work with, I think their previous site, you'd go into their store and they're very consistent, they're great, like everything is really kind of considered in terms of like color palette and how they're kind of merchandising and like all of their displays and everything else. It's all very consistent, every single piece. And before, you'd look at their site and it was just like, it felt like a Shopify theme. You'd have like bits of content that like around like what sits in the bag and everything else that were kind of just put in a little block on the PDP, and like it hadn't really been considered like how do we get the most out of this content, versus they went for a redesign. And now I feel like the theme is just like a lot more end to end. It just feels like it's been kind of built with around brand guidelines and content. And I think that to me is what a premium brand experience is.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I almost think I'm going to set us a challenge. We're not allowed to use the words premium or elevated for the rest of this episode to describe what being premium is. But I think that point is spot on, actually. It's execution. You start with really good brand guidelines. And those brand guidelines do color palettes, visual typography, use of logos, example of lifestyle, the values and the look and the feel, etc., and the psychographics, I can't even say that word, psychographics around the core customers, all that piece. That's really useful. But the bit where I see people struggling online is it will be a flat design of we need to what a homepage looks like, or a category landing page, one of your richer content experiences for like, new customers being guided through, whether it's a sofas or a beauty range. And then we've got our core PLP with hero content, additional stuff, and our PDP, our default template, plus an enriched version for more considered product selling. And it's all flat designed. And people look at it and go, that looks great. But actually, it might look great on a flat design on the screen, but less thought goes into what I'm going to call 5 key areas. Number 1 is content section, functional capability, flexibility, and extensibility. So we've got a layout, and it is a text plus an image plus a button, whatever it might be, and it looks great. Then all of a sudden you think, how does that play into these other 4 or 5 types of content that we're going to want to create? Is that now going to maintain a consistently elevated, I can't use that word, a consistently strong execution of content and messaging, or are we actually limiting ourselves? And we're going to have to, this comes back to your point, shoehorn it in, because we've got 10 sections. Now we're going to have to reuse those and actually, we'll make a compromise by using this section to do this on this page because we didn't think it through enough. That not thinking end-to-end site piece is one of the areas. Then it's the transition animation piece. And I've seen this before where there might be a simple transition done. You get a bit of text that fades into the page, or a slight bit of movement animation as you go from one section to the next. But then that's repeated ad nauseum through an entire site. And as a user, when you're going through the same thing, it just becomes really quite repetitive and jarring. And then that looks quite cheap in the end because it's repetitive. But the 2 areas that I think really fall down, and it's not necessarily, this is projects I'm working in, or other brands that I've looked at, is the consistency of the visual storytelling and the content that sits within it, and that tonality and the psychology of how the copy is positioned and how it appeals to the audience. I often find that a site can start really beautiful, and then within 3 to 6 months of trading, those principles have started to be eroded in parts of the site as people try and get stuff live.
I think, to me, everything you just described, I think is, because all of this comes down to, I guess, like how you manage a process. But I think all of that needs to be part of the scope of the redesign. So I think when one thing, as you said, that always comes up is like, I think going into a redesign, you have to take a series of, let's say, products as the obvious one, that where they've got more content, richer content, more complex content, longer descriptions, different types of content, and you kind of need to give those as the example. And I'm a big advocate of using real content when you're going through designs, because I think that makes a huge difference, because it's easy to design something with dummy content that really kind of fits, across kind of different components. So I think that's one thing. Second version of that would be other languages as well. So you often see people design for English, but actually, they've got Japanese version of the site, or, whatever other languages that are, hard to design for. And I think you need to design around that.
German's a great example because it's much longer words, and it looks brilliant in English, and you chuck all the German text and you're like, whoa, that's blown the template.
Exactly. I think the other one is like really considered widgets when you're using a third party. Like, again, you'll often see people design without actually really putting any thought into what can actually be done within the third party, or when it comes to like development and it's been rushed because you need third party CSS or like a bit of extra development work. Like, people launch with at least some elements of like default stylings. I'm trying to remember the other bits that you said about there.
That point you just mentioned is really, really good one, actually. And it's something I have to keep reminding myself about, because I had this with a customer review provider. And the design was all lovely. Like, it was a brand whose colors were pretty much monochrome on knives. So it was a very subtle aesthetic, but the PDP and the PLP fit with the review snippets, all nice, really nicely managed. And then you put the third party plug in and it looks utterly shit, because the third-party plugin is the limitation. It's you don't have full control. It is a widget that's controlled through styling within their backend, and their backend styling is basic. That's a real gotcha.
That's a really interesting one as well, because that's where like I think you, in my opinion, benefit from like some element of like, so we're doing a redesign, we would always do for every component and build like a component library. And I think you've almost got to do some level of functional discovery before you give that brief to a designer, because like in a lot of cases with reviews, you might want to use the API, which gives you, and again, this is just from us naturally working with brands that want the flexibility and like don't want to show reviews, they just want to like aggregate data and stuff like that, or they want to use bits of review data and build like a little custom component. But I think in that scenario, you've kind of got to know that you're going to use the API and give the designer that brief, because otherwise, and like you see it all the time where you've got like pretty nicely designed sites, and then they'll just be using the standard Yotpo widget, and even where it looks fine, it's like you click on write a review and it's all just like kind of off brand, and typography is all over the place, and also like the front end dev hasn't kind of finished all of the kind of work in that side of things. And we see that a lot, I think, with different kind of base widgets, and I think that's something that needs to come out a bit more before design.
So we've talked about that, the brand innovation, the premium thing, what that means. How can you define it? How do you measure redesigns that are brand focused? And yeah, I've got my own views on it. I know you do a lot of work with this. There are some sites, I think, that just put out a redesign and the success criteria is brand execution, not specifically tied back to success metrics from an ecom point of view. So what is your advice? What do you look at and how do you measure the impact?
So I think it's it's always been really complex to measure a redesign, because I think there's just so many different metrics and there's so many potential variables. The biggest one being tracking. So usually people will rebuild all of their tracking as part of a redesign, and that can be a major variable straight away. So I think it's really important that someone essentially is accountable for this and takes full responsibility for reporting back on change. I think that it is really hard to measure. And I think, if you've got an AOV above 300 quid, you've also got you're not going to see an impact straight away as well, factored into that. I think for me, having a like for like subset of traffic is really important. So we would often use like branded search and looking at like conversion, AOV, etc. And then where we can, we would also pull out like new customer conversion rate and look at different metrics specific to new customers, because a lot of the time that's going to be where the impact is. And then I think looking at like engagement metrics on kind of some of the higher level landing pages, I think is a like secondary KPI. I mean, realistically, what, commercial stakeholders are going to want from a redesign is improvements in, I think global conversion rate can be the worst metric to look at because it causes so much friction in businesses and there's just so many variables. So I would say conversion rate with like some isolated views on it against different types of customers or different channels, etc. So I think that's going to be your number one, and then supported by AOV, global revenue, revenue per user, etc. And then I think realistically you should be looking at kind of some deeper metrics as well, but probably not at like management leadership level. But I think most redesigns are justified based on uplifts in conversion and uplifts in AOV.
Yeah, the new customer one I think is really important, but equally important is keeping an eye on existing customer segments that are the strong converters, the people who are repeat purchasers, people who are coming in from campaign sources that are correlate to more immediate conversions rather than longer journey paths, to make sure you're not doing anything to alienate those. And I think it's critical to protect existing metrics as well as look at the impact on, I guess, that more content and new customer piece. But you're right, it is tough because, like, let's say you're launching a brand redesign, but that's in the middle of like a big campaign cycle, and you've got all sorts of marketing tests and variation changes going on. It does become more and more complex to basically isolate pure impact.
The big thing that I've seen, so for a lot of the fashion brands again, their peak is sale, and that is fairly consistent from a kind of seasonality or like calendar year perspective, but there are significant variables in assortment of product, level of discount, availability of sizing, like blah blah blah. And I think one thing I've seen is because essentially you come out of a redesign, performance is great or flat, whatever, people are happy. Go into sale, performance is bad or good, one or the other. But actually, there's kind of major variables. And the fact that people want to launch pre-peak, suddenly then there's a lot more question marks going into sale period. Yeah, and I would say, and to be fair, this applies to performance marketing as well. It's always going to be the case. Like, you're always going to look at anything that kind of has changed. But yeah, I think that's something I've seen a lot of. And essentially because that's your change, that's the thing that's kind of then looked at. But yeah, I mean, to be honest, it is really hard to measure. And I think nowadays you've kind of got to going into a redesign, you've got to have a proper, agreed set of KPIs and agreed approach to reporting. And you've got to have someone that can communicate everything that's changed as a result of tracking and navigation, whatever else, so that you come out of the project. And if there are issues, there's like clarity and reliable data. Because I think that I've seen a lot of fashion brands go for a redesign for, a creative agency who are up here. They then think numbers have tanked and they're just panicking and making crazy decisions and, and I think that can be a really difficult position to be in for those brands.
Yeah. The tactical piece, I think, is really important as well. So you pulled out like navigation. A lot of these redesigns involve structural changes to navigation, and some of that is data driven. Some businesses are very good at looking at click paths, looking at the SEO implications, looking at where they have issues with customers finding products, doing some like customer research and insight and overlaying different data points to go, right, you know what, we need to consolidate some categories. We need to introduce new ones for SEO. We need to simplify navigation because people get slowed down, and then test it, the good scientific approach. And that then leads to it's never perfect, but a better execution. And then you can objectively measure click paths. You can measure time in journeys. You can measure the product outcomes from it, versus others who just make loads of changes. And then it's really, it's not, as in we want to as a business change to this and this is what we think is right without having the data behind it. Then it becomes really hard to unpick.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the other thing, we haven't really talked about testing, but I personally think there's a role for testing for bigger, so like not for everything, and not necessarily, split test. I think it can be quite dangerous to split test two completely different experiences as well. But I think if you're making, like, we worked with a brand that was probably quite, it was a considered purchase, and there's a lot of like content that would influence people, and there was a lot of suggestion to change a lot of things from an agency, and we just tested a few different versions of the PDP, and I think that can be really valuable. And I think the same can apply to navigation. Like, if you're trying to make wholesale change, I think it's quite easy to test that. So I feel like there is, if you are making quite a lot of like structural change to product information or navigation, I feel like there's quite a bit of room to test that.
Yeah, 100%. You should always test if you can, if you have the resource and bandwidth. I guess for some people they don't. Either they don't have the expertise in house, or they don't have the budget to invest in a third party to run the tests for them. And I'm not advocating that as a great approach, but we all work in businesses where there are constraints on what we can and cannot do. And that's why I think, come back to your point, is always aim to test. If you can't, you're 100% right that what you've got to do is have a set of metrics, and those metrics have got to be measurable, even if somebody else could disagree with your metrics. As long as you've agreed that set and you've got reliable data and you can track what happens before, during and after, then at least you're doing something in a measurement.
Yeah, agree.
Is there ever a case to not measure? Have you ever worked on projects where people don't? They basically believe so wholeheartedly in the visual changes that they're not looking at what the impact is.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I definitely think there is. I wouldn't necessarily say not measure. I think you have to look at the impact of things, but I think you have to understand. I mean, sometimes you don't, if it's absolutely flying. I think you can see people just saying like, this has been a success based on these, therefore we're not going to put as much time into really understanding the change. Not necessarily saying it's right, but if you've got a lean team and lots of things to do and lots of work to manage off the back, I think I can understand that. I think for a project, if you mean more like, can you just make decisions based on non-data led things? I think you can, as long as you're not making big decisions, in my opinion, and you've got the right people involved. I think if you've got people in the project that have done this loads of times before and they've seen something work, and it's very clearly kind of fundamental best practice UX, I don't think you have to always have data, but I think you do have to rationalize what you're doing. And I think it's just, being comfortable that there's no risk. And I think in a lot of cases, a lot of it depends. Like, if you're literally just taking the goal is performance based and modernizing and, giving yourself more like tooling to trade the site and, manage content and everything else. And you are just literally building a best in class theme, or like best in class, I guess. So kind of making sure that, again, having your experience, people say that they've seen a positive impact of X, and then you've kind of just got a very intuitive, usable theme. I don't think you need to have absolutely loads of data, but I think if you're, a more complex journey, so made to order, for example, or, other kind of complex configuration or multi-step processes, all of that kind of stuff, then I think the more data you can have, the less risk and the more likelihood of uplift you're going to have. But I feel like you do see a lot of brands go into a redesign with no data, and it performs very well. And I don't judge people for not having that data, but I think the more complexity, the more you're going to benefit from the data. I don't know if you agree with that.
For me, nobody should ever do a redesign without measuring it. I personally think it's a bonkers thing to do. Even if the measure, even if the measure, measure an impact, because you're spending money and you're making changes to an environment can impact customers positively or negatively and can impact your commercial metrics. So number one, you fundamentally have to measure, but I do understand your point, which is how detailed and granular do you measure, and how much is the measure based on pure commercial metrics versus wider. So the sentiment piece, I think, is also important, especially if you are trying to renovate your brand, or you're trying to increase engagement with newer customers and educate them around the brand and get them bought into who you are and why you are, so that will influence future purchase journeys. Even just looking at engagement metrics on the site, and the classic heat scroll mapping, looking at engagement content and how that correlates into product journeys. But I think the sentiment bit is also important. So where companies are, reviews is obviously a good one, but that's for purchases. The sentiment around that as well of how are people finding their journeys on the site, and some people have exit intent pop-ups, which is like, how would you define the site today? Tracking that and changes in that. But then the post-purchase on site, like NPS style stuff of like, how likely are you to recommend us? Tracking positive changes in that is also quite a useful one.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, whenever we launch a site, we've obviously got sensors. So we'll have a feedback widget for the first week, and we'll ask for feedback on the order confirmation page, as you say. And I think that sometimes that can be super helpful. Like if nothing else, just for fixing bugs. You don't usually get anything like crazy valuable, to be honest. But I think anything like that can be really good. And like also a lot of brands have got like a WhatsApp group with top customers, like getting feedback, like as part of UAT, like all of that stuff, I think can be, or even just, designs for a design process. I think that can be really useful as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. I'd completely forgotten about that, and I'd already thought about talking about it yesterday, and then that shows how good my memory is. Is that part of, and this sees a lot in replatforming, is having a group of super users who, at the point before you're going live, as part of your UAT, you stress test a couple of user journeys and key design changes just to get like instant visceral feedback to help you refine your kind of your bug fixing phase. I think that's hugely important. And if you're doing, like you said before, if you're doing minor changes where maybe you're fixing one particular path, unless that's a critical conversion path, there's less benefit. But if you're making big changes that are site-wide, to visual aesthetic, to layout, to the type of content, then that's really helpful.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the end of our core questions around measure design. I guess the last point I wanted to cover was, what are the gotchas for e-com teams? An e-com team that is in a redesign process where the redesign has been led by a brand team, a creative team, so it's not owned by e-com, but the execution is. What are the gotchas? What do they need to watch out for? What guardrails do they need to put in place to ensure that they're not compromising their e-com channel because of design decisions?
I think, to be honest, it's the measurement side. Like I think up front, knowing what the KPIs are and really thinking about how you're going to identify negative change in any area that's commercial. I think the more granular, not necessarily the more granular you can go, the better, but like thinking about things like new and returning, thinking about measurement by traffic source, because realistically, if you want to know if there's an issue, like you need a like for like comparison data. I think just getting that whole piece right is the big one. And I think, beyond that, and to be honest, it all comes back to that, but designing for like different types of users and really making sure you're thinking about like what their journeys are as well. But it still comes back to the same point, which is just getting those KPIs and metrics right. And making sure you're kind of thinking about all of those things when you're making decisions as well.
I think this is for me, the most important thing from a guardrail is somebody to have an e-com technical oversight in terms of usability, interaction design, accessibility. Don't compromise in those areas. If you know that a piece of content, a section, a visual design fundamentally breaks accessibility guidelines, or the way that journeys are being designed from a conceptual point of view is not going to be great from usability and doesn't play well into like, mobile transitions, interactions, then just protect that, flag that back in a collaborative and productive way, but help the designers maintain their creative control, but don't allow them to make decisions that will adversely impact execution.
Yeah.
Well, I hope I've enjoyed that. I love it because, design is something I always have lots of opinions on, but I always know that there are people who are far smarter than I in making decisions around it, which is why I enjoy working with the creative teams. Anyone listening anything that you want to challenge or anything you disagree with or anything that you would advise, like how do you make redesign successful? How do you measure it? What's the right way of getting this balance? Do reach out, do let us know. We'd love to hear it. And keep your ears peeled for next week's episode. Take care, everyone. You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast hosted by experienced consultants James Gerd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders, and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience, and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-com strategy and tech stack. follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode.